Welcome back. Still here with us is Sabrina Mahtani from Women Beyond Walls. Sabrina, thank you for staying with us. We were obviously talking previously before the break about how there's surprisingly not a lot of support coming from feminist foundations for the work that these organizations are doing to help incarcerated women. One of the solutions that you've proposed in the report is a set of 10 feminist funding principles in order to sort of address at least part of this problem. Maybe you could walk us through that or give us a brief overview of what that entails.
Sure. So these 10 feminist funding principles are actually were designed by the Astro Foundation, so a feminist funding organization. So they're not coming from Women Beyond Walls, but we list them there because we really think that so many of the challenges that are listed in the report around not just access to funding, but the quality of funding that organizations get can be resolved by these feminist funding principles. And that's why we're really trying to champion more, not only more funding to these organizations, but funding from a feminist perspective. So, for example, the first set of this principle is to fund those most impacted by gender depression. And I think, as we've discussed, women who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated are some of the most marginalized and overlooked women. Another kind of principle is to provide flexible and sustained core funding to activists. And so many of these organizations not only face challenges with getting funding, but the funding they get is very limited. It's project funding, so they can't cover their operational costs, they can't cover staff costs, but also they can't actually fund the issues that they want to fund. They don't have the agency to do that. So that can be extremely limiting. And it also means that they can't respond to any opportunities that might arise, or they can't respond to a crisis that might happen. Another tenet of feminist funding is to apply an intersectional lens to break down funding silos. And we're really seeing this as a key issue. Organizations might get a little bit of funding for legal work, or they might get a little bit of funding from a public health perspective. But really the issues to do with the over-incarceration of women is very complex, and we need donors to be funding this in a holistic way. So we can be looking at not only sort of the individual issues, but also funding and working on some of the research and advocacy and the systemic issues as well. And perhaps a last principle that I can highlight is about going beyond grant making and accompanying activists with capacity building and leadership support. And in our survey, in our report, organizations are also looking for non-financial support. They're really looking for kind of support with networking. They're looking for support with skills building. They're looking for support with leadership. It's really hard to run a small organization working in an incredibly pressured environment with some really, really challenging cases. And if we have leaders who burn out, if we have leaders who don't have the support to pass on leadership skills, then these organizations are just not going to be sustainable. And so that's why I think having, these feminist funding principles are really key to making sure we're not only getting more quantity of funding, but we're getting a better quality of funding as well.
A few interesting, obviously, principles that you brought up over there that I do want to get to. One of them being, the flexibility that these organizations should be afforded as well. One of the areas that you've described as needing support in the report is core funding, obviously. Not only is that hampered by limited availability of these funds, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but is also undercut to some degree by project funding, for example. Why is project funding such an issue? And maybe you could explain to us what this project funding entails.
Yes, thank you. So project funding means that it'll be funding which is often very limited. It might be for a year or 2 years, and it will be limited to a specific project. So, for example, you're going to provide legal services to this number of women, for example. This can be really challenging because it doesn't allow organizations the flexibility that they need to respond to changing priorities. For example, you might have a change in government and you might think, okay, this is a real opportunity now to push for some law reform to change a discriminatory law. Or there might be an emergency that happens, like with the Ebola or COVID-19 pandemic, and you actually can't implement that project, but there's maybe another more important project to fund. But this project funding is very inflexible, and there isn't much ability to change it. And really we're pushing for, and I think that a feminist funding principle is that organizations should have core and flexible funding, because this means that they can self-determine their agendas. They know what the issues are. it means that they can also cover operating costs. Often project funding will not cover operating costs or cover a very small percentage, like 5%. And the majority of the respondents in our survey received less than 25% of core funding in the last 2 years. And a majority of them said that they couldn't even fund key staff positions such as development staff. So, fundraising is also a full-time job. So if you have nobody to do the fundraising, it's sort of this vicious cycle that you can't actually support yourself. And also 88% of participants from our report said that there were strategies they would like to implement, but they couldn't do so because of lack of funding. And 56% said that participants said they would like to undertake strategies that donors will not fund at all. And so that's why project funding is very limited. It doesn't give any agencies to these organizations. Ultimately, they're the ones on the ground, they're the ones on the front line, they're the ones who know what are the needs of this population, they're the ones who know what needs to be done.
So based on your interactions with all these organizations, I suppose, what in your opinion would constitute an adequate amount of funding, perhaps even a blanket level? Should there be a base level of financial support, or would that risk undermining or marginalizing the efforts of some organizations?
I think that a key step here is just to, first of all, have a dialogue between different funders, particularly feminist and women's rights funders and organizations, so that they can better understand what are the challenges the groups are facing, what are the needs. I mean, we acknowledge that. I think our report is a really important step in this conversation, but there also needs to be a global mapping. We interviewed 34 organizations. There are probably a lot more organizations out there, organizations that might not be registered but are doing important work. But there's never been a global mapping of organizations in this space. I think we wouldn't necessarily recommend a particular figure, but we definitely are calling for new portfolios of funding. So to have specific funding pots which are just focused on women's incarceration. We have this for other groups. We have this for LGBTI. We have this for sexual and reproductive health. And we really think there needs to be these specific funding portfolios as well for women's incarceration. And I think, it's really important, again, that we're not just looking at the amount of funding. It's about the type of funding. So we need to have good quality funding. It needs to be core and flexible support. We also need to have, non-financial support as well, sort of capacity building and leadership. But I would also like to see not just philanthropists kind of being involved in this. We also need the private sector to be involved. We need more corporate funding as well, because, philanthropists have many of their own challenges too. And we absolutely also need to see the government take a stand here, particularly to be supporting organisations who are delivering really key services like legal services, mental health services. They need to also kind of step up. But I think, we have a key opportunity. At the Generation Equality Forum, over $40 billion was pledged for gender equality. This is a really key and exciting opportunity now. There is money out there, but we need to make sure it goes to all women. We can't only fund some women.
And you'd obviously mentioned over there the issue of government funding, which we previously talked about. But I was curious, what exactly is preventing the government from investing more in this? Is it again an issue of like negative bias or perception of the issue, or what exactly is driving this government's or most governments' decisions on this?
I think it really varies from country to country. I mean, obviously, for some governments, for example, in the global south, where resources are very limited, then, often, people who are incarcerated at the bottom of the pile. And I mean, certainly from my work across the African continent, I really see its criminalization of poverty. So here are some of the most poor and marginalized people, and they're never going to be on the government's top list, unfortunately. In other countries, I think, yes, I do think stigma and sort of these negative perceptions really play a role. And particularly when we have governments who want to have a tough on crime stance, then they may not also be willing to kind of invest in other kind of areas. But I think it's also a lack of foresight from the government and perhaps a lack of data, because we do know that, for example, if you incarcerate a woman, it's not just the impact is huge. I mean, there's massive impacts on children. There are over 19,000 children worldwide who are imprisoned with a parent, mostly their mothers. And lots of research has shown that children with an imprisoned parent have many issues going on in future, from educational, society, health issues. And so, the government needs to look at this social cost of imprisoning a woman. And if I can give an example from the UK, it costs over, I think it's £55,000 to have a woman in prison. So that's a place for one woman in prison. But actually giving women support in a community centre, which is much better for her and her family, costs between £1,000 to £4,000. So actually, this is something the government really needs to look. Governments need to look in further, because it's actually saving society a cost, but also government a financial cost as well.
Sabrina, obviously, this is an issue that needs a lot of attention and recognition, so I hope it does get that. But thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
That's it from us here on All About Money. We'll see you again next week.